are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum's new Zoom series, Trolleyology. My name is Kristen Fredrickson, and I'm the Events and Programs Assistant at the museum. Thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks to those who have joined us in previous weeks. Over the next couple weeks, museum staff and volunteers will share programs featuring Pennsylvania transit history topics that you can experience from the comfort of your home. Now, we have some viewers here who have visited the museum before and some who volunteer here, but for those who might be new to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, we were established in 1954 as the Ardent Electric Railway by a group of trolley enthusiasts called the Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club. The museum opened to visitors a few years later in 1963 and is actually located along the route of the trolley line between Pittsburgh and Washington, PA. Here you'll find almost 50 trolleys and electric railway cars, about 20 of which operate, and around 30,000 visitors per year take the 4-mile scenic ride here at the museum. Now, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Dennis Cramer. Dennis has volunteered at the museum for 26 years in both the operations and publications departments. Today, Dennis will be presenting on the Allegheny Valley Route, a heavily industrialized area along the lower Allegheny River Valley served by 3 streetcar lines. At the end of the presentation, we will have a question and answer session with our presenter, but the chat box is open, so please feel free to enter questions and comments during the show, and Dennis will be able to read through them at the end. And please keep your microphones muted and your videos turned off during the presentation so that Dennis has all the bandwidth available for the slideshow. Dennis, take it away.
Oh, thank you so much, Kristen. It's great to be here today, and it's great to see so many folks here with us. I would like to just take a moment to thank everyone for being here and talk a little bit about how this presentation came into existence. Prior to June 2018, Ed Liebarger, Bruce Wells, and myself had worked for about 2 years working the book that you see in front of you. And the book was published in June of 2018 as we celebrated the completion of the restoration of Car 832 from the Allegheny Valley Street Railway Company, which was part of the West Penn Railways family eventually. Ed conducted the bulk of the research into the corporate history, and he authored about 2/3 of the text. I did about another third, and Bruce did the wonderful maps that you're going to see in this presentation, and laid out the entire book for us before it went to printing. So it really was a collaborative effort from the beginning. And on a personal note, this is the 21st year that Ed, Bruce, and I have worked together in publications, and I can tell you it's a joy to work with both of those gentlemen. We'll learn more about this photograph as we get into the program. Now, this looks like an awful lot of information coming at you at first. We're going to be discussing 3 separate trolley lines. West Penn Railways eventually took over the Allegheny Valley. The Trenholm, Brackenridge, and Butler, which was a separate entity, and then we'll also be talking about Route 78 on Pittsburgh Railways. Don't worry too much about this map right now, because as we do each section, there will be a blow-up of it. The Allegheny River Valley is and has been a major transportation artery since before the French first explored it in the late 1600s. This valley is rich in natural resources: lumber, coal, limestone, iron ore, salt, oil, sand, and gravel enabled early entrepreneurs in the development of industry. The river was the first means of transport, but by the mid-19th century, the Pennsylvania Canal and eventually steam railroads on both sides of the river opened the area to more development. By the end of the 19th century, the electric trolley era had begun, and the valley soon joined the bandwagon. This program will cover the 3 lines that serve the lower valley. Now, just a word of warning for those of you who want to do some research: the names Allegheny Valley and West Penn appear both in the corporate titles of railroads on both sides of the river and trolley companies. And so you have to kind of be careful when you're looking at those. Like many, there were fits and starts as local communities attempted to work out details with the fledgling street railway companies. The Tarentum Traction Passenger Company was incorporated on May 20th, 1890, and the first operation occurred 4 years later in 1894. By 1900, The company was operating cars very similar to number 4 that we see here on 4.5 miles of track from Natrona down to Creighton. There was no viaduct across the railroad in Tarentum, so passengers had to get off one car, walk across the railroad tracks, and transfer to a waiting car. Imagine having to do something like that today, but the steam railroads were pretty adamant about having trolley cars crossing their tracks. By 1901, an extension to the New Kensington Bridge was completed and the tracks were laid into New Kensington. And operation began there in 1904. So if you can see my cursor, we're going to start way up here in Natrona, and we're going to follow the line down along the river. It's going to come into Brackenridge. This is Brackenridge Borough. And then it's going to come into Tarentum Borough. And the wonderful thing when you drive along these roads, you can't tell when you're going from one town to the other. We're going to come down, we're going to come up Corbett, go out 4th, come around the car barn, go up over top of the railroad, come out 7th or west, and then come down along what was out Freeport Road to New Kensington, where we're going to cross the river and go into Westmoreland County and go up to Arnon and down towards Parnassus. The line began at Federal Street at Vine in Natrona, just east of the railroad. This area looks very different today as all the buildings in that area are now gone. This is one of the few areas that has changed dramatically on the whole right-of-way that we'll be discussing on all 3 routes. The area to the left of the now photograph is now part of Allegheny Ludlam, and in that photograph we're also looking directly towards the Allegheny River. And that is the railroad line you see in front of you is the Norfolk and Southern low-grade line that follows the Kiskiminetas and Conemaugh River back towards Blairsville. Industry grew. The office building still stands today in Natrona. The trolley companies made it much easier to commute back and forth to work. And there was a lot of work in this valley. Some of the major factories included Owens, Illinois Glass, the Pennsylvania Salt Company, Allegheny Steel that we see here, the Tarentum Paper Mills, Pittsburgh Plate Glass, Acme Steel, the Liberty Machine Works, Ford Motor Company had a glass factory there, and over in New Kensington we had Alcoa Aluminum. Looking at the photograph on the top, the larger photograph, the river is to the left, and so we're looking downriver at this point. Population in the valley towns nearly doubled between 1900 and 1910. To meet increasing demands, the Harmer Street Railway and O'Hara Street Railway merged with the Tarentum Traction Passenger Company to form the Allegheny Valley Street Railway Company with William Mellon as president. The line followed River Road that we've seen, and here we see one of the larger cars purchased by the Allegheny Valley in 1906. Notice the awnings on the hotel. Life was very different 120 years ago than it was today. No one had air conditioning, and so it's very usual to see awnings to help provide some shade. The building today houses several apartments. And you notice it happened to be a rainy day when we were out doing some of our investigating. The line turned from River Road onto Mile Lock Lane and then onto Brackenridge Avenue. It was here that the first car barn was located. Now, unfortunately, what happened, especially in Brackenridge and Trenholm, is they changed virtually every street name in both of those towns. So what they call Brackenridge Avenue today, we would call 3rd Avenue. In the upper in the then photograph, we're looking, once again, we're looking south, we're looking downriver. This was Mile Lock Lane, right over here. Where these folks are standing and looking, very similar to where we're standing over here looking, directly behind us was where the original car barn was. There was absolutely no sense in trying to take a photograph of that area today because it's a giant wall. Allegheny Ludlam Steel Corporation is directly behind us. But this is where the first car barn was. And just to in case you happen to look at a map and wonder where in the world is Brackenridge Avenue, it's now 3rd Avenue. Continuing south, the line traveled 2nd Avenue down to Corbett, where it turned to East 4th and eventually to the new car barn built in 1906 along 2nd Avenue. The line was finally completed to Aspinwall and the connection with Pittsburgh Railways Route 1001 in October of 1906. The new cars carried over 10,000 fares on the first day of service. The Trenholm to Pittsburgh fare was 50 cents, 37 cents cheaper than the fare on the adjoining Pennsylvania Railroad. And in this view, we are actually looking upriver, and so I decided to take the same view again. On a personal note, it's kind of fun that this little schoolhouse over here that is no longer a school was a school in 1975, and that was one of the buildings that I did some of my student teaching in way back in the day. It's always fun to be able to research an area that you have worked and explored for a good bit of your life. During the second half of the first decade of the 20th century, urban street railway business had lost some luster. Companies were constricted by municipal franchises that set fares that did not keep up with costs. The Mellons were astute businessmen and came to the conclusion it was better to be bondholders than stockholders. They had already been putting money into Gulf Oil, which they founded in 1901, so hedging their bets on the newfangled automobile. By 1912, the Mellons approached West Penn Railways, a 150-plus mile system that traversed much of the Coke region of Westmoreland and Fayette counties, to see if they were interested in buying the Allegheny Valley Street Railway. The sale was completed in 1917. Also included in that sale was the power company. While at first the street railway companies made a lot more money for the company than the power companies did, that was eventually going to change. This is one of the more famous photographs that appeared in the local newspaper at the time, and you notice the sign that says the last straw leaving Tarentum in 1937. Well, that can't possibly be true because the last car left Tarentum in 1937 at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I highly doubt that this photographer had the kind of flash to be able to take that daylight picture as it was today. Another little note, just down the side street, just beyond us here, beside the newspaper company, is where the power company's very first powerhouse was located. There's nothing there now but a parking lot, but it's kind of interesting to note that just the same. This location was a major repairs facility for the Allegheny Valley, and it was built in 1906. The car that we see pictured coming out of the car barn was acquired that same year. They bought 9 of these cars. They were 42 feet long, and they carried about 44 passengers. You notice some of the workmen and some of the crew members all standing around being very, very proud of the cars. And it's interesting when you interview people from that time period and how they adapted and shared news and information. Because let's face it, you were going to ride the streetcar to work every day. You're going to ride the streetcar home from work every day. And you're going to possibly pretty much be on the car with the same people. And so they shared the news of the day. Remember, in 1906, there was no such thing as radio. And so, let alone television or computers or internet or any of that kind of fun stuff. And so life was very, very different for these people. And it was a much more personalized view of being able to deal with things. Here we see another view of the car barn, and we see what looks to be a protest. Well, shortly after sale to the Mellons, there were 2 labor stoppages by the men of the Allegheny Valley. The first one lasted from December 1913 to February 1914. And in this image, we see some of the protesters near the car barn as the strike breakers run the car. A strike lasted from July 1915 to December 1916, almost a year and a half, and all the union carmen lost their jobs. Now, we talked earlier about connection with Pittsburgh Railways. Prior to the second strike, the Allegheny Valley cars used to run the whole way down into Pittsburgh. They would change operators in Aspinwall, and the Pittsburgh Railways men would take the cars down the rest of the way. Well, after the cars were being run by strike breakers, Pittsburgh Railways wanted nothing to do with any of that, and so that was stopped. And from that point until the end of service in 1937, you had to switch cars in Aspinwall, and we'll see some photographs of that as we get to that point a little later. Interesting, not long after 1916, this line saw the peak of its ridership. The peak of its ridership was in 1919 when they carried almost 8 million passengers. Not too bad for a 22-mile streetcar line. This image is going to take a little bit of explaining. This is a now and then photograph. The photograph on the left is from Penn Pilot, and that was taken in 1939. The photograph on the right is from Google. And to get across the railroad, a viaduct was constructed in 1901. Here is the viaduct right over here. We're looking at the black and white photograph. And it's possible to see the car barn in both images. This is the car barn here, and this is the car barn over here. So what happened was the tracks came down this way, turned left, came around the car barn, and then went up and across the viaduct and eventually down West 7th Avenue. Trolleys stopped using this viaduct in 1937, and it was closed in 1949. The current bridge, which is over here, was opened in 1952. We can see Bull Creek running along both of these lines, and we'll also, a lot of this was devastated during the 1936 flood, sorry. So here we see the Trolley Viaduct. The upper view shows where Ross Street is today. This is where Ross Street would be, right along here. And so we're looking directly up towards what was at that time Tarentum High School. It's now Highlands Elementary School building. The view over on the lower right is a view looking from the viaduct down towards, across the railroad, down towards the train station in Tarentum. This train station is now a restaurant, and I can tell you it's a great place to eat. Ed and I have eaten there quite a few times when we were out on our sojourns, and it's a nice, pleasant view, and every once in a while you get a pretty healthy freight train coming by. This view over here is looking along the railroad tracks, looking downriver and underneath the viaduct. Once above the railroad, the line turned left and headed down West 7th Avenue. The new owners of the trolley line, West Penn Railways, invested in new signal systems, new trucks, those are the wheels under the cars, whistles, air brakes, lifesavers, and they've replaced the track and the brickwork between the rails. And here we see two of the same views on West 7th Avenue. We'll talk about the newer cars in just a little bit, but this is a great opportunity to see the lower part of Tarentum. Moving on down Freeport Road, we come to Bart Street and the Creighton Hotel. The small cars seen here resulted in complaints from the passengers. They were rough riding and they were out of date. However, the ability of the trolley line to connect the communities was an important one. So there were many places of employment along this stretch of Freeport Road. This is down, PPG was down here, the Ford glass plant was down here. There was a lot of work down here on the left-hand side. I mentioned earlier that we talked about, I mentioned the word lifesaver. And if you look at the upper photograph, the crew member is standing in front of a lifesaver. And this was designed to scoop you up and keep you from being run over by the trolley. If you've ever seen the video, Streetcar, the cars that built our cities, there's a wonderful demonstration in that particular video showing how that little thing works. All cars coming from Tarentum cross the Allegheny River to New Kensington, the major shopping area on the entire line. This is Bouquet Junction, was at the western end of the New Kensington Bridge. So this car is coming from from Tarentum, and it's getting ready to cross the bridge. This part of the Y would be headed down toward, if you're coming towards the camera, would be headed towards Aspinwall. There were through tracks, but it was rare that the cars went straight through. One went Natrona to Parnassus, and the other one Aspinwall to Arnold. Tracks were laid across this bridge in 1902 to access New Kensington. And this is from the west bank of the river looking across the river, and this is from the New Kensington side looking back. Now, I mentioned earlier about the railroads having issues with trolley companies crossing their tracks because of safety. At the lower end of the bridge on the New Kensington side, the tracks cross part of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And so for them to get permission to do that, they had to put in a separate switch that was called a derail. That operator came across the bridge. The conductor had to get out of the car, throw the derail so that the car could continue across the railroad tracks. And once the car crossed, he would go back and throw it back again. And when he threw that derail, it put up a red signal on both sides of the railroad. This was all done to make sure that a runaway car didn't get hit by a passing train. Now, what would have happened if the car would have run away? It would have gone down, hit the derail, gone to one side, and run into the curb. And so, obviously, safety was in their minds. This is New Kensington. The line ran up 9th Street to 5th, where a Y was located. Cars heading from Aspinwall went towards Arnold, and the Trenholm cars headed towards Parnassus. And you notice there's a good bit of shopping here. This was the central business district of New Kensington. This area looks very, very different today. We'll see a little bit of that in a moment. And this is where the majority of the folks came to do their shopping. Over the years, the Valley Route had 2 different stations and 2 different locations. This one is 906 5th Avenue. The other one was 305 9th Street. And you see a typical West Penn sign that they would hang on the front of the cars. It tells you the main areas we're going. So you're going to go from New Kensington to Aspinwall, and then you would change cars and go on to Pittsburgh. The transfer stub down below, the conductor folded that over, and so he only had to punch once to punch 2 different parts of it. He would give the right-hand side to the passenger, and they would decide whether they were going towards Tarentum, towards Aspinwall or Natrona, and which one of the zones they were going through. So this portion went to the passenger. You see the little perforation right there. It's kind of tough to pick up on the scan. And this side stayed, that went in with the conductor's fares and everything at the end of the day. This image shows passengers boarding one of the new cars along 9th Street. These cars were built by the Cincinnati Car Company, and they were put into service on Valentine's Day, 1930. And I'm going to talk a good bit more about these cars when we finally get down to Aspinwall. Notice the dress of the people on the street. This would be a typical work day. We see people with coats and ties. Obviously, it's cold because they have their top coats on, but it's a typical shopping day in New Kensington. So now we come to our next portion of the map. So up here we see New Kensington. We're going to come down along. We're going to come through Springdale, Cheswick, Acmatonia. We're going to cross underneath the Pennsylvania Turnpike, Indianola, down to Harmerville, and then we're going to continue along the river, along Cheswick, and down through Blawnox, and eventually towards Aspinwall. The nice part about the entire routing of the Allegheny Valley is that you can drive it today. There are virtually no markings that it was there. The only thing you can't drive on, obviously, is the viaduct. But you can drive Freeport Road, or what eventually became Pittsburgh Street, the whole way down through and get a good idea of what the area looked like. Verona's over here, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. There were plans at one point of building a line from New Kensington down this side of the river, the east side of the river, to Oakmont. And there was actually a company put together before Trenholm Traction Company came together. William Mellon looked into putting together a different Allegheny Valley route. The only problem was that there's just no room over here. The railroad was already there, and there was a hillside, and to come up over the hill and down into Oakmont was just too far away. And if they came along the river, no one lived there anyways, and so it would be virtually zero passengers. This new bridge was opened in 1927, and this is the current bridge that is still there. You can see they put the track, 1927, they put the tracks back in, and we see one of the newer cars headed back towards the west side of the river. The wonderful thing about being able to study some of these small lines, especially in places you've lived and worked, is being able to actually go down and go along a lot of lines and have a good time visiting them. A new power plant was opened by West Penn in Springdale in 1920. This is the new power plant down here. This is the larger power plant that's still there, and it enabled the company to increase capacity. The second power plant was the Creighton Power Station. It was located up Bailey's Run Road. It's no longer there, but it was served by a branch off of the Pennsylvania Railroad. This plant is now completely gas-fired. This is Springdale. Springdale had the largest population base between New Kensington and Aspinwall. Local shopping, the West Penn and Duquesne Light power plants, coal mines, and other factories were all sources of local patronage for the trolley line. Trolley companies didn't just build trolley lines to build trolley lines. They wanted to make money. These were private corporations. These were not publicly funded corporations. They needed to be able to try to make a buck. Most of them weren't very successful at doing that, but they tried, and so they went where the people lived and where the people worked. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the double trolley wire when we get down to Aspinwall, but you notice that there are two wires up here. In 1936, the St. Patrick's Day flood devastated much of the lower Allegheny Valley watershed. As a matter of fact, the line between Leechburg and Apollo completely went out of business and was never reopened. This is along Pittsburgh Road, just north of Springdale, and you can see that the water is out on the road. They lost service for a few days, but they weren't devastated. There are photographs of some streetcars in downtown Pittsburgh that you can see just the roofs of their cars. The flood was pretty dramatic. Improvements to both highways and equipment continued. As more and more automobiles came of age, the fight for space grew in more intensity. You can see the tracks here and the little narrow street, and this is the same corner, and you can see the street is about 3 times as wide. We had mentioned earlier that, in 1919, they carried almost 8 million people. By 1932, they were carrying 2.5 million people. What happened? This little guy right here is what happened. The automobile. This passing sign is near Harmerville, and it shows the amount of room needed for both means of conveyance. Here's the road back here, not very wide, and we have a passing siding, which is taking up easily the width of another lane of road. This is the barn in Harmerville before one of the many road changes near the Halton Bridge. Originally, the highway went on the right side of the barn, and this barn was used to basically house the cars that worked on the lower end of the line. There was no sense keeping all the cars the whole way up in Tarentum and having them every morning, having to run the whole way down to Aspinwall. So they picked a spot about halfway between New Kensington and Aspinwall to build a second barn. Here we see the barn again in the upper photograph, and now the highway is on the upper side. If you try to go there today, this is what you're going to see is down on the lower right-hand side. This is Freeport Road, and up above it, this is New 28. And right in this little parking area is a great place to park if you actually want to watch the Eagles up over the Halton Bridge area. This is Freeport Road near the Halton Bridge. You can see in the top photo and the bottom photo that the apartment buildings are still the same. You can see, obviously, as we mentioned, the streetcar tracks on the left-hand side of the road taking up a good bit of highway space. The photo on the left-hand side was taken in 1915. The Allegheny Valley tracks were still there, and you can see how close they were. None of this was all this hillside over here. None of this was available for road traffic. This was before the 2015 rebuilding. This was part of Freeport Road, and they eventually replaced the Halton Bridge altogether. This is Aspinwall. Aspinwall is where the Allegheny Valley met Pittsburgh Railways. This section of Freeport Road is recognizable today because of the wall built by the Pennsylvania Railroad. This is going up to the Brilliant Branch. And this is just before the lines met at Loop Street. And the trolley line in the upper photograph is under construction. Note the double wire. We talked about it a little bit earlier. Trolley companies often used double wire to facilitate higher running speeds by avoiding wire frogs as switches. So what would happen? A northbound car would use the wire on the right-hand side, and a southbound car would use a wire on the left-hand side. And when they came to a switch, there was no issues because there were no frogs, diversions of the wire up above, which can create issues for trolley poles. This is Aspinwall, Loop Street, where in the early days, valet cars would continue to downtown Pittsburgh. But as we mentioned, after 1915, passengers had to change cars here. So we see a low-floor car sitting in front of a West Penn Railways 800 car. The 800 series cars were introduced to the public with great fanfare. A tremendous parade was begun in Natrona with over 500 people watching, and a young lady from each town along the way was selected to represent her community. Here we see the final christening in Aspinwall on Valentine's Day, 1930. The remains of the Billy Baxter Ginger Ale, right down here, appear on the street as the enthusiastic crowds welcomed the new cars. The next day, the 12 cars were put on display in the various communities, and a pamphlet was handed out as a souvenir of the occasion. These cars could run about 43.5 miles per hour, about 10 miles per hour faster than the older cars, and they carried 48 passengers. This introduction was a really the next few slides are going to show some of what the newspaper did. They put out an entire streetcar edition welcoming people and walking the new streetcars. They had 12 different young women christening the fleet. They had an entire program of activities. West Penn Railways brought their band up from Connellsville by bus to ride along on the cars. And this is an example of one of the ads. These were full-page ads, and you see all the different communities that participated in these as part of this streetcar edition. And all the businesses, it was amazing. This was 1930. 4 months earlier, the stock market crashed. This was the beginning of the Great Depression. A message from your 12 cars. Welcome to the valley as friendly strangers and as citizens. Strangers will not remain, but good citizens we will. It was absolutely amazing. A little Valentine greeting card down here from West Penn to the Allegheny Valley. I'll give you a moment to let you finish reading the signs on the side. We mentioned the 12 cars and the 12 ladies. Well, these are the pictures of the 12 ladies, and every car had a name. It was a tradition that goes back into the 19th century, and by the 1930s, no one else was doing this. But Allegheny Valley, part of West Penn Railways, really made a big attempt to make this all work. On the right, we see the ad by the Billy Baxter Ginger Ale Company that they were going to christen it. Why ginger ale? It's 1930. We're in the middle of, and we're also in the middle of Prohibition. This is a celebration of the day. So they began at 7:15 up in Natrona. At 7:30, they went to tree siding for Miss Brackenridge. At the Trenholm Car Barn, Miss Trenholm joined the parade. At Creighton, they had, at the Crucible siding, they had Miss Creighton. And then at the same times, on the other end of the line, they were having Parnassus and Miss Kensington doing their little bit. They joined, came over and joined, and then Miss Springdale and Miss Blawnox joined in. These cars were not in the parade. They were all christened in their own little communities, and then they went on. And then on Saturday, the next day, they had a public inspection that you could go and view the cars between 1 and 3 o'clock. To continue on the next day, between 2 and 4 on Sunday the 15th, you could ride the cars for free. Now, I'd also note that children must be accompanied by adults. The end was inevitable. Freeport Road was not wide enough, and a Chamber of Commerce survey in 1933 showed 121 deaths, 446 injuries, and almost 3,000 accidents. Billboards appeared along the highway reading "Highway to Death." The Allegheny Valley was asked to abandon the route north of the bridge. That was impractical, as the main repair facility was in Trenholm. After much back and forth, Allegheny County paid West Penn $100,000 to close the line. Here you see the line coming along. This is in Creighton, taking up a good bit of the road. This is when they rebuilt the road, and this is what the road looks like today. This is 703 Freeport Road. Full-time bus service came. The Harmony buses began running, and they all started actually a little before the end of the line. And notice the same fares were the same on the bus as they were on the trolleys. And they also used the same stops. The end of the line, that was it. Finis nears for trolleys. Pictures of early cars. This area really, really appreciated what all those folks did. So what happened? The 12 cars were moved to Connellsville the next day via Pittsburgh Railways and ran through 1945, when most of them were excess. West Penn Railway ceased all trolley operation in August of 1952. Car 832, which ran on the South Connellsville line, was saved and eventually bought by the fledgling Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club, which eventually became the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. The car was moved to the museum site along the former Pittsburgh Railways interurban line to Washington in February of 1954. Restoration was begun during the 1970s, but it wasn't until a grant secured from PennDOT that work could begin in earnest. This funding, along with many individual donors, enabled the museum to send the car to Brookville Equipment Company for bodywork, and she was returned to the museum, where for several years many of our volunteers labored until she was returned to service on June 1st, 2018. And here we see her there, running on our line. And very shortly, the museum is going to be reopening to public service, and you will soon be able to ride on her again. The next line is the Trenholm, Breckenridge, and Butler Street Railway. It ran its first trip in 1912, and there was never a direct connection between the Allegheny Valley and the TB&B, even though the lines were a few feet apart. And we'll see some images later on where they actually pulled the cars across the gap. So the line's going to start up here and come down Freeport Road, turn onto Morgan. There was a switch down here. This part of the map doesn't actually, we inadvertently left this off of our map in the book, but there was a line that went up to the Brackenridge PRR station. It came down 6th and back over to 7th. Connected Trenholm and Brackenridge with the area now known as the Heights. It used single truck cars with hand brakes for its entire existence. And this is the end of the line up in Birdville, right by where the McDonald's is today. Single cars, hand brakes, one-man operation. Notice he has his changer with him. He has to do all the work, including changing the poles. This is the area along Freeport Road that now contains a 4-lane highway with a side street known as Broadview Boulevard. This is Montana. The car is crossing Montana Avenue, which is right here, and this is the interchange of Montana Avenue today. Obviously, it has grown quite a bit. The trolleys did their work. The line turned at what's now Morgan Street down to head over the hill. The company never owned more than 6 of these small cars at any one time due to them being destroyed in accidents. The steepest portion of the line was here, close to 12%. TB&B car 100 wrecked on the icy rails here in 1937 and was destroyed, but luckily neither the operator nor the passenger was injured. The S-curve, an S-curve came from here down around this way and back around this way, helped reduce the grade. And in this photograph down here, you can see the S-curve would have come down along, and this is Bruce and I taking a look at where the maps ever went. This is looking the other direction down Prospect to 6th Avenue in Brackenridge. And this was the cover photograph that Kristen had put on at the beginning of the show. This is the end of the line, East 7th and Ross Avenue in Tarentum. This is what it looks like today. If you notice in this photograph, this is the end of the tracks. The Allegheny Valley was right over here, and you can actually see the marks in the bricks where they drug the cars from one side to the other. The TB was one of the smallest lines in the country to last as long as it did. The last trip was made in 1940. The legacy of the line is the thriving communities along its former route. Many of these early subdivisions that we see here were all advertised as within walking distance of the line. The line ended up in here by the McDonald's, but all of these were considered to be within walking distance. A mile or two was not an issue at all. Painter plan of lots is here. This is Campton over in here, and the Wilburn plan of lots is up in here, up above the Bertner house. The third line to serve this portion of the Allegheny River Valley was operated by the largest streetcar system in western Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh Railways completed Route 78 from Wilkinsburg to Halton in 1904. So here we're going to see Wilkinsburg. A lot of this is on private right-of-way. Unlike the TB&B in the Allegheny Valley, you cannot drive on a lot of this right-of-way. And then this map continues here, down through into Verona, up to Oakmont, past the Halton Bridge, up to the original end. Many trolley lines build amusement parks to build ridership. Many other entrepreneurs built their own parks to access the passing riders. Usually it was a win-win in many situations. Dream City, however, outside of Wilkinsburg, was not one of those win-win situations. The 20-acre park was opened in 1906 and it closed in 1916, just a 10-year existence. The most famous trolley park in western Pennsylvania, of course, is Kennywood. The line came down from Wilkinsburg through Sandy Creek, much of it along private right-of-way. This routing provided much more patronage than one that could have been built along the Allegheny River Boulevard from Highland Park to Verona. There are no houses there. There are still no houses along that portion of Allegheny River Boulevard, and so it made much more sense to do this. This is Sandy Creek. The road on, that's right, if you're familiar with this area, all this is Coal Valley Road. and the trolley is going right across the trestle. Route 78 was shortened 3 times. Highway improvements were the cause. The first cutback was to the southern end of Oakmont at Plum Street. And here you can see the then photograph, and the church steeple is still there in the now photograph. The old viaduct seen here carried the cars between Verona and Oakmont. This is the old viaduct going across this way. It was constructed earlier, and then it was replaced in 1935 when Allegheny River Boulevard was completed. So originally the road went up to the right in the new photograph, which is this portion of the road, and then the viaduct went across. All this was removed, and Allegheny River Boulevard now comes straight across this way. This was the second cutback, and the cars no longer ran into Verona. They stopped at Allegheny River Boulevard along Wildwood Road, and the line was eventually cut back to a shuttle service between Wilkinsburg and Laketon Road, and the last service in 1952. Projects such as this are not a one-man job, and we would certainly like to thank all of our operator contributors who have worked tirelessly to collect materials for us to be able to continue to present them to you. And so that's the end of the presentation. Kristen, I believe, has a few slides to show you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dennis. And if anyone has any questions for Dennis, please type them in now. We will be using our chat box for questions today. And Dennis, you'll see we had 1 or 2 and some comments if you'd like to scroll through. But before we wrap up, I do want to mention our other upcoming programs. Next Tuesday evening, volunteer George Gula will be presenting On the Warpath, Pennsylvania's Trolleys during World War II, which will be our last Trolleyology presentation this month. But later in the month, we will host a virtual version of the Western Pennsylvania Trolley Meet, where we will have a series of programs over the 2-day event, including repeats of a few Trolleyology presentations and some more interactive sessions like a Share Your Slides Nostalgia Night program and a Trolley Museum showcase where more than a dozen of the trolley museums around the region will be sharing some updates from their staff and volunteers. And we should have links to sign up for these available shortly on our website. On the main page, you'll see a West Penn Trolley Meet at Home Edition banner right there on our front page, patrolley.org, and you'll be able to sign up for all of those programs very shortly. All right. And thank you, everybody, for coming today. If you enjoyed the program, please help us continue sharing them by making a donation at patrolley.org/support. And there are other ways to support us, too. At that link, you'll also see how you can become a member of the museum or volunteer here at PTM. All right, Dennis, do you see some of those questions there?
Yes, I do. And the first one, Bill Heller says the fun fact that inside the Highland Tire Company in Trenholm, the brick floors and the trolley tracks are still there. We have a photograph in the book of that. Those folks were very, very enthusiastic in welcoming me into the building and giving me a tour around. It's a really, they're a great bunch of folks. And like he says, the tracks are still there. It was a bus garage for a while. And then when the Port Authority sold it, Highland Tire took over, and that all came out wonderfully. Ed Kaler wants to know what's the status of 832. 832 is ready for training and it's ready to go. So we're excited about that. There's been a lot of work done during the pandemic, and we want to make sure that everyone has a chance to come down and do that. And Bill again says, well, Campton still exists. Yes, all of those housing developments up there still exist. And they did a lot of advertising, including pictures of the trolleys in their ads. As I said earlier, the trolleys helped build these communities. Joe wants to know if the book is still available. Yes, Joe, the book is still available in the museum store. Bill Heller wants to know about the trolley service in Leechburg. What line was there? It was called the Pittsburgh and Allegheny Valley Street Railway Company. I've also authored a book on that because that's part of Armstrong County. And we may be doing a program on the trolleys of Armstrong County at some point. We're not sure about that happening yet at this point in time. But Bill, if you'd like to message me someday, we could talk about that and have a great chat. The line stretched from Leechburg basically to Apollo. So are there any other questions, comments? Bob Jordan just says 8:32 is out in the sunshine today and prep for a special tour tomorrow. And once again, I also would like to thank all of you for joining in today. This has been a lot of fun. It's a great idea that was developed by the staff at the museum. We're very, very thankful for all of the great work they do. And we hope that you take a little bit of time maybe and drop a donation in. It's been kind of tough being closed for 3 months or so. So thank you again. And Kristen, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Dennis, and thank you, everybody, for joining. And especially thanks to those who have been joining us week after week and to those who provided feedback from our survey last week. The links to the upcoming talks, the one for next week is already posted on our website. So if you see the Trolleyology banner on patrolley.org, you can sign up for the On the Warpath, Pennsylvania Trolleys During World War II next week. Thanks again, and have a wonderful week, everyone.